6th June 1944, Sword Beach, Normandy. A German Unteroffizier named Heinrich Naube crouches inside a concrete bunker of the 325th Infantry Division, watching through a firing slit as a squat, ungainly tank climbs over the debris of the shattered seawall. He and his men have trained for months to recognize Allied armor from silhouette cards. This vehicle matches nothing on those cards. It carries a gun barrel unlike any tank cannon they have studied. Short, absurdly wide, almost comical. Naube's unit keeps firing anyway, and for a moment it seems to work. Shells crash around the strange tank, smoke and dust boil across the esplanade, and the Germans lose sight of their target entirely. They cease fire to save ammunition and let their gun barrel cool, confident the position still holds. Then the smoke clears, and the tank is still there. Whilst Naube's men have been sighting on shadows, Royal Engineers offshore have been walking heavier fire onto the bunker's roof, and each burst flexes the thick concrete ceiling and sends fragments raining down onto the defenders below. Now, this squat tank rolls closer still, well inside the range at which its strange short gun becomes lethal. What Naube does not yet know is that this vehicle carries a demolition charge nicknamed by its own crews the Flying Dustbin, a weapon built for one purpose alone: to end exactly the kind of concrete fight he thinks he is winning. Within moments, the bunker's certainty collapses along with its confidence. This was not a single isolated fright. Along every beach, the British and Canadians assaulted that morning, and in bunker fights for the rest of the Northwest European campaign, German troops learned the same lesson Naube's unit was learning in real time. When this particular Churchill appeared, staying inside the fortification that was meant to save you had become the most dangerous place to be. To understand why the Flying Dustbin so unsettled the men who faced it, it helps to go back 2 years to a raid that very nearly killed the whole concept of engineer tanks before it was born. On the 19th of August, 1942, Canadian crewed Churchill tanks went ashore at Dieppe in Operation Jubilee. Popular memory has turned this into a story of tanks that never even made it off the beach. But the truth was worse in a different way. Of the 29, landed 15 did climb the seawall and reach the esplanade, only to find concrete anti-tank obstacles the planners had not accounted for, blocking every route into the town. Marooned on the promenade under direct fire, several of those Churchills were eventually knocked out or abandoned, and a number fell into German hands. The raid was a disaster, and in its aftermath there was serious pressure within the British Army to scrap the whole Churchill program. But a small number of engineers and planners drew a different lesson from Dieppe. The problem had never been the tank's armor, which had shrugged off hits that destroyed lighter vehicles beside it. The problem was that no British vehicle had carried the means to blast a path through concrete obstacles and fortified positions on demand. At the moment, infantry needed it most. Out of that failure came the Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, or AVRE, and the weapon that would define it, a spigot mortar developed by the secretive research group MD1 that traded barrel length and muzzle velocity for something no ordinary tank gun could offer, an explosive charge many times heavier than any conventional shell of similar caliber. Trials through 1943 settled the design. In place of the AVRE's usual 6-pounder gun sat a stubby 29mm spigot mortar, firing a finned bomb around 230 millimeters across, weighing 40 pounds, and packing 28 pounds of high explosive inside a thin casing. Its official name was the petard. Its crews, taking one look at its shape tumbling end over end towards a target, called it the flying dustbin, and the name stuck far more firmly than the ministry's. By late 1943, the weapon was ready, entrusted to Major General Percy Hobart's newly formed 79th Armored Division, whose collection of specialized vehicles would soon earn the affectionate nickname Hobart's Funnies. The petard's genius lay in a trade-off most conventional gun designers would never have accepted. A standard tank cannon fires its shell using pressure built up along a long barrel, which limits how large that shell's diameter can practically be. A spigot mortar dispenses with the barrel almost entirely. The bomb itself carries its own propellant charge in a tail tube that slides over a fixed steel rod or spigot, and when fired, the whole assembly leaves that rod together, meaning the projectile's diameter is no longer limited by anything the gun has to contain. The cost was accuracy and range, a mere 80 to 100 yards at best, and a punishing reload procedure. The loader had to traverse the turret until the barrel sat directly over the co-driver's hatch, at which point the co-driver would crack open the breech, post a new bomb in by hand with his arms briefly exposed outside the tank, and close it again, all while under fire. It was slow, dangerous work. But for the specific job the AVRE was built to do, leveling reinforced concrete at close range in support of infantry, pinned down by exactly that concrete, the trade was worth making, and nothing else in the Allied arsenal did the job as directly. The AVRAS got their first large-scale test on the morning of the 6th of June 1944, landing across Juno and Sword beaches as part of the 79th Armored Division's support for the assault. At Grez-sur-Mer on Juno Beach, one AVRE from the 26th Assault Squadron came ashore early, only to plunge into a bomb crater more than 13 feet deep, hidden beneath the sand. 4 of its crew died trying to escape the sinking vehicle, and 2 more were seriously injured. A stark reminder that these were desperately dangerous machines to crew even before they fired a shot in anger. Along Sword Beach, meanwhile, Unteroffizier Naube's account of the fighting around the seawall captures precisely what German defenders experienced as the AVRS and their supporting Churchills closed in. Heavy naval and tank fire flexing the concrete overhead, the defenders half blind with dust, and then the appearance, at frighteningly close range, of a tank whose gun profile matched nothing in their recognition training. Once within 80 yards, an AVRE crew needed only 1 or 2 well-placed petard bombs to cave in a bunker's embrasure or bring down its roof. And word of what those bombs did traveled through German positions faster than any single engagement could explain on its own. By the later stages of the campaign, in the brutal bunker-clearing fights around the town of Goch in February 1945, British forces had turned this into settled doctrine rather than improvisation. Gun tanks with 75mm or 95mm weapons would first pin a stubborn pillbox with direct fire. If the garrison still refused to surrender, an AVRE would move up under that covering fire and put a flying dustbin directly into the position, and only if that failed would the flame-throwing Churchill crocodiles be brought forward to finish the job. The 3 vehicles worked as a single escalating threat, and defenders increasingly chose not to wait to discover which stage they would face. A wartime assessment of the Crocodile alone credited it with roughly 5,000 surrenders during the campaign, and it counted barely 150 men actually killed by flame to achieve that result, which tells its own story. The mere approach of Hobart's funnies had become, for many defenders, a more persuasive argument than the fighting itself. What actually caused this shift in behavior becomes clear once you understand what a petard bomb did on impact, compared with what German troops were trained to expect from a besieging tank. Ordinary tank and artillery shells rely mostly on kinetic penetration or a comparatively modest explosive filling to damage a fortification, and reinforced concrete bunkers were specifically designed with thick roofs and angled walls to defeat exactly that kind of attack. The flying dustbin sidestepped the whole problem. Rather than trying to punch a hole and detonate inside, its oversized charge simply overwhelmed the structure with blast, transmitting shock through the concrete itself, flexing roofs that were never designed to flex, and showering the interior with fragments even when the outer wall held. Men inside were as likely to be killed or buried by their own collapsing fortification as by the explosive itself. This is precisely the mechanism Naube's account describes. The roof did not need to fail outright to become lethal. It only needed to flex enough to shower the men beneath it with debris. Combine that blast effect with the AVRE's own heavy armor, which let it close to within the mortar's short effective range, while surviving small arms fire and many close artillery bursts along the way, and defenders faced a genuinely novel problem. A vehicle they could see coming, could shoot at, and often could not stop, carrying a weapon whose effects their own fortifications had not been designed to survive. None of this made the AVRE an unambiguously superior weapon of war in every sense, and it is worth being honest about its limits. An effective range of under 100 yards meant every single engagement required the vehicle to close to a distance at which almost any anti-tank weapon, mine, or well-sighted gun could threaten it, and AVRE losses in that final approach were real, as the fate of the Grey-sur-Mer crew shows starkly. The reload procedure that briefly exposed the co-driver's hands outside the hull was a standing vulnerability that never went away throughout the vehicle's service, and the AVRE could not have won a single battle on its own. It depended entirely on gun tanks and infantry to suppress a position long enough for it to get close, and on flame-throwing crocodiles or ordinary infantry assault to finish positions its own mortar could not crack outright. It was, in other words, a specialist tool within a combined arms system, not a war-winning weapon by itself, and its psychological effect on German defenders was inseparable from the fact that it never appeared alone. That specialist role, though, proved durable enough to outlive the war that created it. The basic concept behind the AVRE, an armored chassis carrying a demolition weapon built specifically to defeat field fortifications at short range in direct support of infantry, was judged successful enough that the British Army kept building on it long after 1945. The AVRE designation itself was carried forward onto later chassis, and a Centurion-based AVRE remained in British service into the 1990s, seeing action as recently as the Gulf War, still performing essentially the same job of clearing obstacles in fortified positions that Hobart's engineers had defined on the Normandy beaches half a century earlier. Few pieces of specialist wartime engineering earned that kind of institutional staying power, and fewer still did so precisely because of a lesson learned from a failed raid rather than a triumphant one. The flying dustbin story begins in the end with a disaster at Dieppe that very nearly ended the whole Churchill program, and it closes with a weapon so effective at the one job it was built to do that defending soldiers, faced with its approach, increasingly chose to abandon the very positions that were supposed to protect them. Unteroffizier Naub's bunker on Sword Beach was one small piece of a pattern repeated up and down the invasion coast and then across the campaigns that followed into Germany itself. Gun tanks to pin, an AVRE to close the distance, and a stubby mortar with an unglamorous nickname to finish an argument that reinforced concrete had been built to win. It was never a graceful weapon, and it was never a safe one to crew. But for the men on the receiving end, elegance was beside the point. The dustbin only had to arrive once